Joanna, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Hello, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, in a few weeks now, you have a great new book coming out about Uzbekistan, Silk Mirage. And I thought I'd begin by asking if you could give an overview of the country.
Okay, yes, indeed. I have my new book coming out on the 13th of November, Silk Mirage Through the Looking Glass in Uzbekistan. So, Uzbekistan, I know you have a lot of listeners who are probably not that familiar with Central Asia. So, Uzbekistan is a country at the heart of Central Asia being a region that's kind of sandwiched between Russia to the north, China to the east. So, lots of big powers around us, a lot of competition for influence in the Central Asian region. Uzbekistan's the biggest country by population in the region, and it's kind of at the heart of Central Asia. It's the only one of the Central Asian countries, the five former Soviet countries, sometimes collectively known as the Stans, although they don't like that. It's the only one which actually borders all the other ones, and it also borders Afghanistan to the south. It was ruled for 70 years or so by the communist Soviet Union. It's been independent for 34 years, and of course, going further back into history, it's a land of Hans and Emirs, Emirates, the Emirate of Bukhara, and it's of course astride the ancient Silk Road and famous for its kind of cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, all those names that evoke the sort of exotic Silk Road and an exotic caravan trading past.
Yeah, one of the first books I sort of properly read as like late teens was Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game. So the Uzbekistan is the country that those sort of romantic Orientalist ideas about Central Asia. So the Bukhara, Samarkand.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that's something that sticks in a lot of people's imaginations, and especially when you've got those kind of rip-roaring tales like the book you mentioned, Peter Hopkirk's books about the region. But in Silk Mirage, my book's about the sort of more about the modern day, it is about the modern day, although I do dip into history to see where Uzbekistan came from and how it got where it is today. But I also kind of want people to kind of see beyond all those Silk Road pictures that are conjured up in people's imaginations. And I want to conjure up Uzbekistan as a sort of living and breathing place that's full of not exotic people, but people who are just like you and me, who have the same kind of hopes and aspirations, but are battling maybe different problems. Because a lot of my book does focus on the kind of the authoritarian nature of the regime and the people who kind of kick back against that regime. How does it work? How does it function? And how do they do that? And what happens to them when they do that?
I mean, the last time you were on, we were talking about your book, Dark Shadows and Kazakhstan. And kind of as you touch on, it's easy for a lot of people who are unfamiliar with Central Asia to just view it as like one big homogenous swath of territory. And so I was curious about what distinguishes Uzbekistan from Kazakhstan and Uzbeks from Kazakhs.
Now, that's a really good question, and I think it's very easy to see. And indeed, I mentioned that people lump the five countries together as the Stans, and the Stans themselves hate it, of course. They are extremely distinct, and we can take the two that you mentioned, and those are a very good way of taking it, actually. I've written a book about Kazakhstan as well, Dark Shadows. So if we take Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they have such different histories. I mean, first of all, Kazakhs were a nomadic people for until about 100 years ago, actually, many of them. So Kazakhs had a nomadic history, and although Uzbeks emerged from nomadic tribes many centuries ago, they have a much more sedentary culture and history, and that's why you get all these kind of amazing, incredible monuments in Uzbekistan, and in Kazakhstan you don't get so many of those because nomads tend not to build great big temples and mosques. And speaking from the point of view of language, I mean, Uzbek and Kazakh are both Turkic languages, and four of the Central Asian states speak languages that are similar, that have Turkish roots, or rather, Turkish actually has roots from the Central Asian languages, to be more precise. And only Tajikistan speaks a Persian type of language. So they have their differences, but they do speak different languages. Socially, I think, there are a lot of differences. I mean, Uzbekistan can be considered in a way quite a conservative society, although, of course, it has very modern aspects too, and there are large groups of, say, liberals and so on. But Islam plays quite a key role, despite sort of 70 odd years of secularism under the communists, and despite having for the first 25 years as an independent state, it was ruled by a very brutal dictator who very much suppressed Islam. So, Islam was suppressed for at least 100 years, and there's now some kind of bit of a revival of interest in Islam. And of course, in Kazakhstan, Islam plays a role too, but I would say that the role of religion is quite a lot stronger in Uzbekistan. Both are, we can say that both are authoritarian states. All the states of Central Asia are to one degree or another, and you can take those varying degrees from Turkmenistan, which is a very repressive and closed dictatorship, to say sort of slightly freer ones, such as Kazakhstan perhaps to a degree, and Kyrgyzstan at least until its recent history.
On the point about history, it just made me think of, there's a bit in Dark Shadows where you talk about the attempt at making a Kazakh Game of Thrones, and sort of an attempt to I don't want to say create a history, but to weave together a history to represent Kazakhstan being a much older state. And with Uzbekistan, that history just kind of like tumbles out. Like no manufacturing sort of necessarily has to go into it, because it's just there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, as you mentioned, yeah, in Dark Shadows, I do talk about the Kazakh Game of Thrones, this film and miniseries that they made, partly in response to kind of Russian attempts to kind of, diss their history, for want of a better word, to undermine their history. In Uzbekistan, they do have this very long and illustrious history. Of course, there's you can see it so visibly in the buildings, the blue domes, the famous blue domes of all these Silk Road cities. But Uzbekistan is also engaged in kind of, let's call it the remaking of history. I mean, this is of course in no way unique to Central Asia, and it's been done in all in practically, I would say, in every country, including in Britain. This kind of reshaping of history to suit political purposes. But Uzbekistan, it's true that while it has this very long history, it's actually in the process of kind of bringing to the fore the history of about 100 years ago, which was suppressed under the Soviets. And so this is in a way a similar thing to what Kazakhstan is doing, which is taking something that happened in history and then giving it a new emphasis and a new importance. And of course, we always see how politics can affect how history is interpreted. It always does. What Uzbekistan is looking at is a movement that emerged about 100 years ago, centered on Bukhara, and it was a reformist movement called the Jadids. It came to be called the Jadids, and it wasn't unique to Bukhara or Uzbekistan, what later became Uzbekistan. It was happening in many parts of the Russian Empire, and it had echoes of things happening in Turkey as well. But nowadays, Uzbekistan is very interested in this history and presents this history as the kind of first attempt to form an independent Uzbekistan. Now, those Jadids, they were active in the Emirate of Bukhara, which was a very kind of despotic and medieval style empire that existed until, 100 years ago, until basically the Russian Revolution came along and wiped everything away. And those Jadids were trying to reform that empire. What's happening now in Uzbekistan is there's a president who came to power now nearly 10 years ago, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, who has a big reform agenda, and he and his kind of supporters present this kind of thing, this kind of history, and his rule is now presented as an echo of this history. In other words, you've got a kind of despotic state, and you've got some reformers who come along and try to change it, and you've got the kind of enlightened reformers, and so they've reinvented this history, if you like, to make it echo what Mirziev calls his new Uzbekistan. But it's a fascinating tale, and it's also a fascinating story about how, politics always affects how history is interpreted in every country. I mean, in some countries, there can be more open debates, I would say. We can talk about interpretations of colonialism in the United Kingdom, for example, in America, or slavery. And we can see that there are lots of open debates, sometimes quite vicious and impolite, but there are open debates. In Uzbekistan, things are a little different, because it's a more authoritarian state. It's quite easy to be carried away without having a proper debate about what this history really was. For example, some historians from the outside think that they're kind of exaggerating somewhat the kind of freedom fighter element of the Jadids 100 years ago to suit their own purposes. But it's a fascinating tale, and I tell it through an interview with an octogenarian historian who told me the story while sitting in the kind of mansion in Bukhara's old town where one of his illustrious relatives used to live, and that was Faisallah Hojayev, who was kind of the first leader of Uzbekistan in its sort of modern incarnation, around 100 years ago, when the entity that now is Uzbekistan was formed. So read about it in Silk Mirage. It's a really fascinating tale, and the historian is a fascinating guy. His name is Suleiman Inayatov. He's now about 90, and at the end of our interview he had us dressed up in old Bukharan costumes, photographing ourselves on the terrace.
But the main theme of Silk Mirage is sort of the kind of, as you touched on, the transition from the sort of despotic regime of Islam Karimov to the seemingly more open one of his successor, Mirziyoyev. Obviously, Karimov dominates the book, kind of like the way he dominated Uzbekistan. And so to start getting into it, I thought I'd begin by asking, who was Karimov?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, Islam Karimov has cast this huge shadow over Uzbekistan. He ruled for the first 25 years of its independence, almost exactly. So a quarter of a century was Karimov's rule. Now, he emerged from the Soviet Union because Uzbekistan got its independence after the USSR, the communist USSR, collapsed in 1991. And he, at that time, was Uzbekistan's leader, but he was the leader of Soviet Uzbekistan. So he was the leader of the Republic of Uzbekistan, but that republic was governed from Moscow. But he basically was a kind of Soviet apparatchik, really, who grew up through the ranks of the Soviet Union to hold various posts. He built his career. Much of his career was in what was called Gosplan, which was the economic planning division of the Soviet Union, and it was because the Soviet Union, didn't function on supply and demand, but was a command economy. The Gosplan, where Karimov forged his career, was often the butt of jokes because it could never meet the demands of the people. The supply never met the demand. And Karimov then he governed an Uzbek region, and then he ended up as the leader of Soviet Uzbekistan, and then became the president. The first presidential election that Uzbekistan faced after independence in 1991 featured an opposition candidate, but that was the last one that featured an opposition candidate. So it's been 30 odd years now, and Karimov became notorious for crushing opposition of all kinds, and political opposition, certainly secular political opposition, hounded out of the country into exile or thrown behind bars. Karimov also targeted what he saw as religious opposition. He viewed the lure of Islam as a potential, alternative power center, if you like, to his rule, and he was paranoid about the practice of Islam, and he had thousands upon thousands of pious Muslims thrown into prison, and often on extremely spurious grounds. I mean, wearing a beard could be enough to get you arrested under Karimov. So he was a very dictatorial leader. Some of the landmarks of his rule. He presided over the shooting of protesters in a city called Andijan in 2005. Torture was rampant in his prisons. He had a notorious prison camp opened called Jaslik, which was incredibly harsh conditions and notorious as a torture chamber. It became famous as well after 2 prisoners died there from immersion in boiling water. So, Karimov then became notorious as the dictator who boiled his opponents alive. It was a very grim place. It was a very grim rule. I mean, Karimov would have defended himself by saying that he was fighting extremism and potential terrorism, and there were terrorist attacks in Uzbekistan, as in many countries, suicide attacks and so on. And it's true that Uzbekistan lives in a difficult neighborhood. In the 1990s, there was a civil war in neighboring Tajikistan and in neighboring Afghanistan. So, it is a difficult neighborhood. But his reaction to all that was not to fight extremism, really, but was to actually fight Islam. So that was the first 25 years of Uzbekistan's rule, and that was Islam Karimov, a prickly character. He shut off Uzbekistan from its neighbours. His borders were sealed, closed. People couldn't visit their relatives on the other side. It was a very difficult time and a very traumatic time for Uzbekistan, given the level of repression. He died in office in 2016 and is nowadays... after all I've said, it might sound surprising, but nowadays he is remembered with a certain fondness, and even on the official level, although his successor Shavkat Mirziyoyev is reforming what he inherited, he also hails Karimov as the founding father of Uzbekistan. And I do talk in the book, I have some scenes from Karimov's grave, which is in Samarkand, which is his birthplace. And, it's now a sort of place of pilgrimage for Uzbeks. That seems paradoxical, given the level of repression they suffered under Karimov. But I guess that's a measure of the kind of paradoxes we're talking about when we try to explain what is Uzbekistan today.
I mean, something I thought you convey really well in the book is the sort of the fear of not knowing what can happen in a regime like that. Like, someone could open up a business and, unbeknownst to you, you have crossed a Secret Service mafia boss, and then you're thrown in prison on trumped-up charges, and then you serve a term of 3 years, and then maybe the day before you're due to be released, you're told, oh, now you've now been sentenced to another 7 years, and just the complete unpredictability of living in that kind of regime.
Yeah, I mean, that is indeed... the unpredictability, the never knowing who you're going to cross, or the feeling that you can be arrested anytime, whoever you are. I mean, generally, of course, you will have crossed someone. And we have to point out that under Karimov, there would be many ordinary Uzbeks who would admire him as a leader and wouldn't fear him because they didn't think they had anything to fear, perhaps because their families had never come across, arrests and so on. But having said that, given the scale of arrests, and given that Uzbeks have very large families, very many people had come across something in their family that had a person who had witnessed repression. And this level of unpredictability, as you say, I mean, the practice that you talk about, that you just mentioned, of extending prison sentences arbitrarily, is one of the cruelest things, I think. I mean, there are many cruel and brutal things that I talk about in the book, and it's quite harrowing at times. But one of the cruelest things was this constant extension of prison sentences for certain types of prisoners, especially political and religious dissidents. But bearing in mind, religious dissidents might mean anybody who liked to pray. And these people would, as you say, be slapped with extra years, maybe just as they were about to be released, and they would be slapped with another 7 years or whatever. I mean, I interviewed a former political prisoner in in the city of Andijan, and he explained to me how he'd been sentenced to, I'm forgetting the exact figures, but he'd been sentenced to, for example, 6 years, and he ended up serving about 15. He only came out because Mirziyoyev came to power and started releasing political prisoners. And he would explain how, as he put it, any excuse would do to give you an extra sentence, and that might include having an untidy uniform, a button missing. I remember Human Rights Watch compiled a report many years ago when Karimov was still in power that detailed kind of some of the cases where people had had extended sentences. And I remember some of the most it would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. The pretext that would be used would be putting your slippers in the wrong place or failing to peel carrots correctly. And those are genuine examples of people serving years and years and years extra in prison. So you see the unpredictability of the regime. And what astonished me when I spoke to that particular political prisoner, whose name is Israel John Holdorov, about his experiences, what astonished me was the dignity with which he recounted them, and the level, of course, of some degree of fatalism, but also the dignity and the principledness that makes people fight that kind of regime. And when I asked him at the end of the interview, are you not bitter about what happened to you? You lost, I think it was somewhere between 15 and 20 years of his life he lost in prison, and he had never committed a crime. And he immediately said he was bitter. What he was bitter about, he immediately said, was about the difficulties Uzbeks faced in their lives, the poverty, still nowadays, the poverty and various difficulties. And I said to him, but I don't mean about other people, I meant about yourself. And he said, oh, no, I think that a person... That's what a person is there for. You have to fight for what you believe is right. So that's an amazing story.
I'm curious about what it's like for you to report on these regimes.
Yeah, these are authoritarian regimes that don't always welcome journalists. In the case of Uzbekistan, I lived in Uzbekistan my book spans the period of 30 years now, and I did live in Uzbekistan from 2001 to 2005, so 25 years ago. So I have experience of Uzbekistan throughout all that time, about a quarter of a century of experience. When I lived there, the regime, I thought it was incredibly brutal and appalling, but what we didn't know at that time was that it was going to get worse. From 2005, after violence took place in the city of Andijan and the government shot protesters, the regime got even worse. I lived there as a journalist, but I did a desk job at the BBC. It was not an on-the-ground reporting job at that time. And I left in 2005, and I continued to be able to visit Uzbekistan, but really international journalists were barred from that time until Karimov died and Mirziyoyev came to power and let them back in. But I continued to be able to do some private visits and little bits of reporting through kind of loopholes. Now, it's very difficult because you're aware of the risks that you're putting other people into when you do reporting from an authoritarian regime, and even now, including nowadays under Mirziyoyev. But of course, the people that you're talking to are also aware of the risks. Mirziyoyev allowed foreign journalists back in after about a decade when they were pretty much barred altogether from Uzbekistan. I was one of them, and I was accredited to work for The Economist. So at that time, it became easier to report, although I say that, but people are still very nervous of talking to journalists. They're afraid of getting into trouble, and the government also was very eager to control the reporting. At that time, there was a very good news story coming out of Uzbekistan. People were talking about the Uzbek Spring after Mirziyoyev came to power in 2016. And for several years, there was a lot of good news about Uzbekistan being a kind of bucking the world trend of like more authoritarianism and liberalizing. And it was a great story, and the government loved that. Since that time, however, I haven't been able to receive my accreditation in Uzbekistan for a couple of years now. They don't give it to me anymore because, I guess they don't like the reporting that I did because it wasn't always positive and because there are many negatives to report. So I would say that reporting in these authoritarian regimes, it is extremely challenging, and you are aware of the weight of the risk. But I don't mean for myself, I mean for other people. For myself, I was detained by the police once in Uzbekistan when I was reporting on a bout of violent turmoil in Karakal, Pakistan, which is an autonomous region of Uzbekistan. And that was in 2022, and the police hauled me in, and when I was interviewing people about it, and kept me for a couple of hours.
Something I was curious about reading the book is, like, why Mirziyoyev decided to liberalize. Like, you know, as you just said, it seemed to be bucking the trend of things that are happening in 2016. And so reading Silk Mirage, I was sort of trying to understand, given that Mirziyoyev was prime minister for a very long time, Karimov's number two, very much a part of that regime. What were the motivations to liberalize? Was this something he really believed? Was it external pressure?
That's a really good question. I mean, when Mirziyoyev came to power, he'd been Karimov's prime minister for 14 years. He was very much this consummate regime insider. Nobody expected very much to change under him. Everybody was expecting perpetuation of the status quo, dictatorial path, regime consolidation, not regime change. Of course, it wasn't regime change, and it hasn't been. But Mirziyoyev really took everybody by surprise when he started his liberal reforms. What prompted it? Well, he's never explained in any detail what prompted it, and that's an interesting fact in and of itself. And that, I think, is down to the contradiction that he doesn't want to undermine the rule of Karimov entirely, because first it would undermine his own role, because he served Karimov not just as prime minister but also as a regional governor, so for 20 odd years or more. He fit 25 years, he served Karimov nearly. So it would undermine his own role if he questioned everything and said, well, this system was entirely wrong. And secondly, it would make Uzbeks also question the very foundations of their nationhood, and it would be extremely difficult. But I think what must have happened, and this is speculation on my part, that he realized that there were advantages to reforming. As well as disadvantages, which I think have become obvious too for him. Disadvantages for him, not for the people, maybe. I think that he probably realised that, for example, if you liberalise the economy, people were really struggling under Karimov. They're still struggling economically under Mirziyoyev. But under Karimov, there's a large pie in Uzbekistan. It's gas rich, it's gold rich. It's got the largest population in Central Asia, so it's a big market for services, telecoms, anything. But it was so monopolised by, the cronyism, the corruption, and this was personified by Karimov's own daughter, who's now in prison in Uzbekistan on corruption charges. So you've got this pie that's being monopolised by Gulnara Karimova, the president's daughter, and also by the security service, which a security service is not meant to be a prominent player in the economy, but it was, and still is probably, but it was. And so I think Mirziyoyev realised that there were advantages to opening up, liberalising, and letting some market forces come in and act. That this would attract foreign investment. This would improve the lot of ordinary people. And one thing I would say about Mirziyoyev is I do believe that he does seem to have some concerns for the lot of ordinary people. Maybe that's because he's afraid of them reacting or protesting, but unlike Karimov, who never seemed to pay any attention to that, and also would actively criticise, for example, labour migrants who would go abroad because they couldn't get jobs at home, he would call them lazy and so on, which is just obviously nonsense. But I think Mirziyoyev saw some advantages, and he must have felt perhaps that there's a pressure cooker in Uzbekistan. He must have felt that there are limited advantages to being one of the world's worst dictatorships. That, you're getting all this bad press all around the world. You're not getting investment. You're not going to be able to help the people. And maybe at some point the people will rise up. I can only assume that some of that went through his head. But I have to say that one of the problems is when an authoritarian leader comes and tries to reform, and Kazakhstan has experienced this too, is that I guess it becomes obvious to them that there are limits to what they want to do, because there are limits to what's to their advantage. I mean, if they were to have a truly free political system or a truly free press, then there would be political competition for them, and they don't want political competition at the end of the day. If there were checks and balances on their power, then there would be limitations on their rule, and they don't want limitations on their rule. So that's where we are. I think Mirziyoyev saw advantages to some reforms, but has experienced this kind of break, partly because of vested interest in the system, but partly because of his own unwillingness to take the full plunge and free up the political system or the media entirely.
One of the stories in the book that I really liked is the entrepreneur who set up a online platform to sort of cut out the middleman between cotton farmers and external customers, and how she like pushed against patriarchal farmers, and the message she gives is that this couldn't have happened under Karimov, and so it's a much better atmosphere under Mirziyoyev. But as you touch on in the book, there are red lines that ordinary Uzbeks can't cross. What are those red lines?
Right. Yes, indeed. What are those red lines? I mean, there are red lines in Mirziyoyev's reform agenda in every area. I mean, you talked about the entrepreneur. Her name's Dildora Atajanova, and she's a really successful entrepreneur who's made her business in Mirziyoyev's Uzbekistan. She tried to do a little bit of very small business in Karimov's Uzbekistan. She's very young, she's in her 20s, but she really came up against so many brick walls. Even just trying to run a cafe was impossible, she said. The officials would come and demand to be fed for free, the fire service, the tax service. They would come and demand she would paint the road outside at her own cost. She said it was impossible. And yet in Mirziyoyev's Uzbekistan, she's become a very successful exporter and tech entrepreneur. That's a great news story. However, red lines, yes, there are red lines in the economy. One of the red lines, I think, is just as in Karimov's Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev's Uzbekistan has a big presence of the president's family in the economy. Now, I mentioned before, Gulnara Karimova, absolute scandal that really erupted, and even in Uzbekistan it was known about, even before she fell out of favor. Her activities were well known, and her rapacious attitude to business was well known and was considered a scandal by ordinary Uzbeks. You would have thought that maybe Mirziyoyev would have learned from that mistake, but no. When I say he hasn't learned, I'm not suggesting that his children or in-laws are doing anything on the level that Gulnara Karimova did. However, they have a very big presence in business that's very well known to ordinary Uzbeks, and that ordinary Uzbeks consider extremely nepotistic. We're talking about Mirziyoyev's sons-in-laws, we're talking about his brother-in-law, we're talking about a lot of people, and people do resent it. So red lines is if you get in their way in business, that's a red line. But red lines aren't only in the economy in Uzbekistan. I mean, there are red lines in politics. Mirziyoyev won't allow opposition. I explore in detail in Silk Mirage why that is, and also how that plays out by talking to some of the people who've tried to put up political challenges to him. He says he's a reformer. So where's the opposition then? Where's the political opposition in Uzbekistan? Well, the only person who's really tried to mount a proper challenge to him in terms of setting up a party and actually saying they're going to challenge him for the presidency is a man named Hidinazar Alakulov. And he's experienced just constant harassment, inability to register his party, harassment of himself and his supporters. We've seen UN experts taking that up with the government, but the government denies there's any issue there. His son is now in prison on what he says are trumped up charges and so on. And impossible to register a party, therefore impossible to fight elections. You can't stand as an independent, it's against the law. So no political opposition. I also talked to a celebrity singer called Jahangir Atajanov, and he also flirted with politics in about 2021 when Mirziyoyev was up for his second term. And he wasn't particularly serious candidate, I would say. He didn't appear to have any policies or anything like that. But he was very popular. 1 million or more Instagram followers. That's a lot for Uzbekistan. The government must have taken fright, or somebody took fright, because at one point he told me about how he was kidnapped off the side of a road. He was taken to a deserted place. He was beaten up. He was threatened with sexual violence. He was told, basically, make your music and stay out of politics. That's a red line in today's Uzbekistan. Journalists, they also cross red lines. Social media users, they cross red lines, often invisible. I interviewed a guy who gave me an interview on condition of anonymity, but also a very cloak and dagger interview, hiding at the back of a cafe terrace, watching who's coming and going, and also watching that I'm not being followed. This guy had been imprisoned. He was a social media user with a following, but he wasn't well known, not until he got imprisoned anyway. He wasn't well known, and he'd done something very anodyne, that it wasn't political, but he was thrown into prison only for a few days. But it's about invisible red lines, and he complained of invisible red lines. We don't know what we can say and what we can't say. So there are lots of red lines in Mirziyoyev's Uzbekistan, and people cross them at their peril.
Something that I'm really interested in / kind of afraid of is with Donald Trump's return, a lot of countries no longer need to worry about America if they decide to backslide into authoritarianism. They can be as corrupt as they want, they can be as despotic as they want. I'm sort of curious, with Kazakhstan, with Uzbekistan, will those leaders take advantage of that? Or are there internal or are there external reasons for them to be, for want of better words, normal and professional in the authoritarianism?
Yeah, this is a very big question and a very big concern. The short answer is that I see them already taking advantage of this. They're already doing it. Or let's say they are emboldened. So authoritarian leaders in Central Asia are most definitely emboldened by Trump's rhetoric, anti-liberal rhetoric, anti-climate change rhetoric, all kinds of rhetoric like that. It's not as if, it's not as if America had ever stopped these leaders being anti-democratic or whatever, but there was a kind of break and a wish to present a veneer of going in the right direction, or we're trying, or something like that. Now, they've been very much emboldened. And how do we see this play out? Well, for example, President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev in Kazakhstan, soon after Trump, targeted the American aid agency, USAID, and other non-governmental organizations, he started unleashing a lot of rhetoric about how civil society groups were stealing money and doing nefarious things in Kazakhstan and using foreign money. Now, he would never have said that kind of thing had Trump not been in power, because he wanted to present a veneer of respectability on that front to the West. But obviously he now feels he can say what he really thinks about that. And that is dangerous for civil society activists in Kazakhstan, who are trying to, do useful things for their society, but things that the government doesn't like. And these kind of things are happening in other Central Asian countries. We saw a very hardline speech from the Kyrgyz president at the UN General Assembly. His name's Sadir Japarov, but very hardline speech from him. And the Central Asian presidents are now kind of talk about they don't want to be lectured by the West. They what they're doing is valid, and so on. So they've been very much emboldened. We see with Uzbekistan, we saw a meeting between Mirziyoyev and Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, where they couldn't praise each other enough. And I don't think any previous American presidents would have wanted to be quite so fulsome in their praise of an authoritarian leader who wins elections with nearly 90% of the vote. And we saw, of course, the quid pro quo. We saw Mirziyoyev saying that Trump should get the Nobel Prize, and so on. So yes, Trump is definitely emboldening the leaders of Central Asian countries to not hide their authoritarian tendencies. And this is dangerous for opposition politicians, for civil society leaders, for journalists, for the people of those countries. That's the danger. That's what's really the problem there. They're going to suffer from this because there isn't a powerful American president to at least pay lip service to holding these leaders to account. Basically, there's only Europe left to kind of talk the talk about, requiring democratization. But obviously, Europe is not a very strong player in Central Asia.
Finally, I was just going to end on what are you interested in doing next?
Well, that's a good question. I have to think about it. I mean, obviously there are 3 interesting Central Asian countries left. Some of them I would say are virtually impossible to write a book on, and that means Turkmenistan, because you really can't get in there as a journalist, or barely. I mean, I tried to go there last year just to attend a very anodyne oil and gas conference, and I was refused a visa. I mean, there are lots of things that interest me. I mean, I think I'm very, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are really the countries that I've spent really a lot of time in, and that are the closest to my heart, I suppose. And I think what would be interesting as well, there are some interesting fiction stories to tell that might be based on their histories, or something like that. So far, I haven't got any plans. I'm going to be in the UK, launching Silk Mirage in November. So I'd urge listeners to come along to events. You can look at my Substack, Silk Mirage Substack, or Joanna Lillis Substack, to see lists of events. Come along to the events, buy the book, read about Uzbekistan. And I hope people enjoy the book, and we'll see what comes next.
Joanna, thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Pleasure to be here.